Welcome to the next session. Thank you very much to the Director General for Health for those very warm words in support of the agency and for setting out so clearly the priorities, not just for this public health agency, but for many public health agencies across the world. I'm John Newton. I have the pleasure of being the chair of the Scientific Advisory Board for Santé Publique France, the Conseil Scientifique. And together with my colleague Pierre Avidson, we are going to chair the next session on complex interventions. The only thing I'm going to do right now is tell you that, or remind you perhaps, that the session ends at 12:15, not at 12 o'clock, as advertised. Then I'm going to hand over to Pierre, who is going to say a few words of introduction to the session, and then we have 4 excellent talks with time for Q&A in between. So, Pierre, thank you.
Donc, bonjour à tous.
Good morning to all.
Donc, tous les professionnels de santé publique
So all public health professionals are perfectly aware of the great complexity of and the importance of social environmental determinants on healthcare, on health, as evidenced by the Delaware-Dagren system. That will be presented later on, amongst others. But these are fairly theoretical models. And yet, despite this awareness of complexity, we keep using a silo-based approach with, for example, sectoral approaches like, for example, the National Plan for the Fight Against Smoking, the National Cancer Plan. And within these silo preventions, we rarely conduct in-depth analyses of legacy systems. And this silo approach also prevents us from properly tackling structural socio-economic determinants, which actually transcend all these topics. So we don't tackle root causes, the causes of causes. Now, we use this silo-based approach because it's simpler, because you work with only one community of experts, but also it's because we don't really know how to apprehend and describe the complexity of systems. What method should we use? We should learn to map out systems, and Harry Rutter will present a number of systems and examples later on. The fight against smoking has probably helped us to reduce by a number of influences, and the national tobacco control policy at national and subnational level is also a complex system, and we'll have a presentation by Michele Cecchini on this later on. So this session was organized at the behest of Laetitia Huard. I'd like to thank her, but also I need to thank Caroline Aouz, who helped us a great deal in preparing the session. But now, let me hand over to Laetitia Huard. Our presentation is entitled Individual Choices and Influences, the Interest of an Approach Based on Complex Systems in Public Health. Thank you.
Hello everyone, it's with great pleasure that I will speak. I will go back to what Pierre has said. All public health professionals know that we have to go back to lay the foundations on the same ground for everyone, and then I will give the floor to more qualified professionals so that they can flesh out this topic and substantiate the subject. We'll go back to individual choices and try to explain why these individual choices are actually influenced. I have no conflict of interest. Please, next slide. Sorry. I have no conflict of interest, and I will talk as the epidemiologist that I am. We have all been acquainted with epidemiology within the agency. That's a an expertise that is well represented, we have this common culture of epidemiology. What do we do when we are epidemiologists? What is our obsession? Namely, to find the relationship that exists between exposure and an event. Our job is to quantify this association and to quantify it in the most accurate way. And we try to identify this relationship, talk about the potential biases, and once we have identified the famous delta in a complex equation, we can have this quantification between the exposure and the event, and then we add all the other factors, saying all things being equal elsewhere. That's how we actually work. So normally there shouldn't be any problem in life, because we have had publication on smoking for many, many years, with a lot of research publications that are very complex, that show and demonstrate that there's a strong association between lung cancer and smoking. So nothing is new here. Life is simple. However, life is not that simple, because we have prevalence of smoking in our society. We are not on our own, that's for sure. And we, as evidence has grown from scientific research, we've had tobacco industry studies that are more controversial, less accurate, and uses a common language to ours that is used in billboards and advertising, so as to have a marketing approach and continue carry on selling cigarettes. This is why epidemiology remains fundamental, because data are fundamental. We saw it with the COVID. We've had a lot of fake news that are not necessarily related to COVID. We need to make sure that we know the cause of the sickness, because otherwise we work on a prevention on associated factors but not on the root cause, and it's not efficient enough. And we need to defend science as opposed to marketing campaigns. And what we have done as well is we have learned from these campaigns. Social marketing campaigns where we use the same codes, where you see people that are happy in both campaigns, whether you smoke or not. And that brings about some values that are associated. In the first slide, you would see people that feel happy smoking with a white collar smoking, who's very happy from a high social professional category. And then we have a greenish area where we have people that go beyond this issue of tobacco and that are very happy. So there are various ways of representing the determinants. We've talked about individual determinants. It's an individual choosing to smoke, basically, but it's not so easy. And we know that life, the environment, media will influence these choices, and notwithstanding the data that are widely known by everyone, it is very difficult to reduce the prevalence of smoking. Not only do we have these determinants that go beyond individual determinants, the lifestyle determinants, but they impose upon us, because from when we are in the womb of our mother, and that evolves throughout life. We also have the labor market, socio-economic factors, cultural factors. We have health inequalities that entail inequalities for the fetus itself in the womb of the mother, and we have little birth weight, low birth weight, for instance. We also have overweight problems that's often related to the social class that appear as soon as kindergarten. And when we have 12-year-old, 15-year-old teenagers, we see a lot of obesity. we see that 3% of the children, it's 5% are obese, 3% are from executives' children, and 8% come from workers' children. And we see more and more discrepancies coming from these social inequalities, and I used a quote from Dress, "From birth to old age, health problems change, but inequalities remain." And we have a lot of graphs with a lot of squares and so on, but it's not the subject. I would like to talk about 2, 3 determinants, social determinants that will be illustrated, and we'll think about what social class is, what genre, what gender is, what is a social-cultural determinant, because these are fundamental determinants that will determine also your education, your job, your income, your housing, and intermediary determinants in the meantime. Sorry, I was not on the right slide. Sorry about that. So, these are the structural determinants. That comes from a WHO report. Amid our determinants, we're used to seeing these variables. We have individual determinants, but geographic determinants as well, depending on the territory, where we can see some homogeneity on a specific region. And we also have all-cause mortality, and then we have some discrepancies for deaths preventable by primary prevention, for instance. What we can see, and a certain number of professionals know, is that the whole chain of people is impacted throughout life. Behaviors are socially different, but we can also see it in the vaccination coverage. We talked about HPV infections. We know that socio-demographic and socio-economic criteria are important, that it increases with the level of education and income, and this coverage would be lower for girls whose parent is of foreign origin and for those whose parent is unemployed. So school could be an option to circumvent these circumstances. And we see it in the graph on the right-hand side. The evolutions throughout crises, via the impact that it can have on life, we see that these discrepancies, the gap is actually getting wider, as for smoking, for instance, and that actually is wider when the income is lower. We have a risk of developing a chronic disease, and that actually depends on the lifestyle, on the level of life. We can see it with diabetes. This is quite a striking example. But also for cancers, we have a gradient that will impact on the mortality, and people have health behaviors that would be more favorable, with a risk of comorbidity that will be higher, and less care and less treatments, especially for socially fragile people. That was actually before the crisis. What I'm saying is not new. However, the crisis has changed somehow the status quo. So I'm going back to the structural determinants. You can see that the risk of pathology changes depending upon the socio-professional category and the social circumstances. That's very important. The crisis has put social inequalities at the forefront of society issues. We are in a system where screening, access to screening was free and quite easy. We see that the most vulnerable people were less screened, had a bigger incidence, and we could see it in different countries. The impact on mortality is quite different because it depends on the income. The migration status is also important. We don't always know where people come from, but we use a proxy, which is the birth the birth country, and we have a mortality rate which is lower for those that were born abroad than the French, those born in France, and that is well explained in the literature. That's due to different factors, including a selection of people for migration. There's a lot of selection criteria that are being used, and what we saw during the first COVID wave is that we lost this benefit, and we lost it in a dramatic way, and that shows the effects of these determinants that are structural determinants on the health of people. Well, COVID crisis has put this at the forefront, but we always say that the health of population depends on the health of the most vulnerable people. For the COVID crisis, it's very practical, because if we do not prevent transmission, communication of this disease amongst the most vulnerable, then we cannot stop the epidemic altogether. And this is why actions and measures have been implemented to reach out to them in some territories, such as in Alpes-Côte d'Azur, to reach out the regions that were more far away, that were less accessible and less populated. We analyzed also the direct and indirect effects on the population in terms of in light of the different events, and we looked into the indirect effects that are going to be more important, because we saw with the direct effects the ingredients that we presented yesterday on mental health, and we find them again amongst the adults with the health barometer of 2021 for women talking about depressive episodes that are stronger than for the previous years. It's a strong increase, as we can see, and we see also a breakdown by gender, and we can see a huge difference between men and women, which is quite significant. Then we also see the prevalence of smoking that has evolved. We see a short peak, an important peak after 2020 over 2021. That's quite limited amongst men, but that's actually bigger, more important amongst women. So we can talk about a syndemia that was described a few dozen years ago. COVID is an epidemic of coronavirus infection combined with an epidemic of non-communicable diseases. That's all the health of the population at large that interacts on a social substrate of poverty and inequality, and that will make up health events that are very different depending on the social class and status, and stronger for underprivileged people, depending also on their interior health status situation. You can see that COVID-19 epidemic was a huge challenge. You can see the relationship between exposure and the outcome, but when we add other factors, it becomes more complex. So we need to represent this. The representation is important to understand, to think differently, to think in 3D. And so this is an illustration that is useful for complex systems where we can represent variables that are individual determinants, but also the others, the heart of the driver, namely the infectious disease with the communicability, the people that are likely to be infected, but also infectious criteria that will impact the evolution of pandemic with the performance of the public health measures that will be implemented, and any kind of communication campaigns that we can launch. Trust in public authorities is also an important factor, and we can represent all this to have an overview and to understand. This helps us also define which measures we can implement, because from this graph we can think how we can act on a community's health at large to find a solution. So this comes also from collaboration with biology colleagues. Alors, you won't see anything here. This is too complex. Biology has been working like this for 20, 30 years. There's a strong movement on systems biology with a movement that modeled the whole human body, and especially here you see the human metabolism, and we can represent here, we can have a visualization of all the literature data with an anthill, a huge set of data sets all together in a collective approach to have a visualization of this map. And that is very helpful for public health. Maybe we can have a full, comprehensive map where we can zoom in and zoom out, because sometimes not all the information is interesting. Now, sometimes we have to zoom in on a specific point, and we can also include some measures, and then we feed this map with attempts and trials to see if it works, how it will reduce or not an epidemic. We can define the measures, and we can model the outcomes and the performance and the efficiency of such and such measures. This is what I wanted to share with you as an introduction. Sorry for the small technical glitches. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laetitia. That was a wonderful introduction to the subject. It's my pleasure now to introduce our next speaker, who is Professor Harry Rutter from the University of Bath. Harry has a very distinguished career as an academic, researching on physical activity and obesity, but he's best known for his work on complexity. And Harry was talking about complexity before anybody else, and I'm really looking forward to his explanation. And we can expect some more slides that nobody can understand or read. So, Harry, welcome. I should say there will be a Q&A session for Laetitia as well later.
Yes, so. Great. Thank you very much for the invitation. So this is a 12-week course with 2 3-hour lectures and seminars each week in 15 minutes. So pay attention. And no one has told me what to say. So I think that's important to note. I thought I'd start by talking about problems that we face in relation to evidence, and particularly the ways in which our research structures and systems potentially push us towards generating particular types of evidence. And my hero in all of this is Geoffrey Rose, who was the first person really to point out the difference between a targeted perspective, looking at addressing a risk reduction approach in high-risk individuals. Now, how do I point? I can't point. The red bit on the right-hand curve, the red bit at the top of the curve. I don't think there's is that a pointer? Doesn't matter. The red bit at the end of the curve. This is what we normally do in public health. We identify people who have a disease, who have a risk factor for a disease, and we generate evidence on what works to move them back into the normal range. I've done lots of work on obesity. Lots of the research on obesity is about identifying people with obesity and moving them back into the normal range. What are the interventions that work to do that? Perfectly appropriate, respectable, desirable thing to do. What Rose showed is that there is another approach, and the two approaches are complementary. It's not one or the other. We should be doing both. But there is another approach that is about reducing the risk across the entire population. One of the examples he gave was about salt consumption. If we reduce salt consumption across everyone by potentially quite a small amount, everyone's blood pressure will go down by potentially quite a small amount. Perhaps too small to measure in any one individual. But across the entire population of millions of individuals, every year fewer people will have a stroke. You can't point at any one individual and say, you didn't have a stroke because you reduced your salt consumption by a small amount. But across the piece, That's what happens. But when you think about what our research system rewards, it's proposals that say, we're going to put 300 people in an intervention arm, 300 people into a control arm, we'll do a before and after study, we get 3 years of funding, it takes a year to set it up, a year to write it up, that gives us 12 months to do our research, and we'll see what the effect size is. If you're doing that kind of study, and those are the easiest studies to get funded, it's really hard to identify things that result in unmeasurably small changes over millions of people over decades. It's not that we can't do that research, it does happen, but it's much, much harder to do, much, much harder to get funded. And what that and a number of other things do is push us to something that I've called the dangerous olive of evidence. It's actually just a Venn diagram, but I was at a conference in Portugal preparing my slides, and I had a lovely bowl of olives in front of me, so I made it an olive. And the flesh of this really big, delicious, fat, juicy olive contains all of the interventions we could possibly do for whatever that problem is. Let's say it's obesity. If I gave you all a piece of paper and said, write down your 5 big ideas, your great interventions to tackle obesity, that's what sits in the flesh of the olive. And then we go off and look at the systematic reviews, and we find that some of them have actually been researched. So the olive is stuffed with a pepper, which is the subset of those good ideas for which we have some evidence of effectiveness. And the pepper is then stuffed with a really quite small piece of garlic, which is the subset of those interventions for which we also have evidence of cost effectiveness. Now, I'm sure you're much better off in France than we are in the UK, but in the UK at least, the public health system has no money. So if you're working in a system that has no money, how could you possibly justify not doing the interventions that we know to be cost effective, or even just the ones we know to be effective? Well, the trouble is that the olive is dangerous because the kinds of things that sit within the pepper and the garlic, the kinds of things for which we have evidence, are particular types of interventions. And if we look at this figure from a 2011 Lancet paper on obesity by Boyd Swinburne and colleagues, there's a range across the top. And this is in some ways just a different version of the Dahlgren and Whitehead figure. On the right-hand side, we have individual level interventions. On the far left-hand side, we have big picture structural interventions. The most extreme intervention on the left-hand side might be a carbon tax of $1,000 a ton, completely reshaping our food and physical activity systems. The most extreme intervention on the right-hand side would be bariatric surgery for obesity. One of the indications for bariatric surgery in the United Kingdom is a body mass index above 40. I'm not for a moment saying that everyone with a BMI over 40 should have bariatric surgery, but it's a very rough indication of need. It's a difficult operation to live with, but in the right individual, bariatric surgery can be transformational. You can reverse someone's type 2 diabetes within a week. But we have something like 1.5 million people in the United Kingdom with a BMI over 40, and pre-pandemic, it'll be much lower now, pre-pandemic we did about 6,000 of those operations a year. So fantastic in the right individual, irrelevant as a population level health measure. So Boyd put this wedge at the bottom that says population effect and political difficulty. Putting money into health services is politically easy. Bringing in new taxes, reforming the agriculture system is very politically difficult, but those are the upstream big picture structural things that are likely to be much more effective. And then I've added these wedges at the bottom, which are about the evidence base and also public and political discourse. The evidence base is skewed towards the right-hand side. You can randomize someone to receive bariatric surgery or not. You can't randomize reform of the common agricultural policy. So we have an evidence base that is skewed towards the individual level interventions, which tend to be, there are exceptions across the board here, which tend to be the less effective population level interventions. And if we think about the kinds of things that we should be doing in public health research, there are many dimensions to think about, but one of them is the population level at which we should be acting. The other is the level of individual agency at which we should be acting. So one of the problems with many individual level interventions is they require agency on the part of the individual. They have to have some control over their lives. And in general, the more agentic an intervention is, the more likely it is to widen inequalities. So those of us who are well educated and have good incomes and good jobs have much more agency over our lives than people at the other end of the social scale. So some of those interventions might have an effect on people like me, but not on people who are already suffering from deprivation. So in public health in general, we should be aiming for population level and structural rather than agentic interventions. But when we reviewed the research funding from our National Institute for Health Research, what we found was that most of the research was in the bottom left-hand corner. I'm not really blaming the funding bodies because the applications are, for the reasons I've given before, tend to be down towards the individual level things. I'm not blaming the researchers because that's where the money is. These are difficult things to shift, but we're putting our research money largely into the wrong places for public health evidence. One of the reasons for this is that we don't have enough of a grasp of complex adaptive systems. You've seen one system map already, but I think it's really important to try and convey in 10 minutes some of these concepts. So what do we mean here? Well, I guess the core point is that, the epidemiology, some of the tools of hard public health are really good at doing the stuff in the room in the middle here, but then you leave the room and you have to encounter the real world and deal with the messy realities of things that interact, interfere with one another, and it's just not that simple. We've seen one map of a system already. We can just look at, I could talk about these for days, but here's an example of a representation of the physical activity system. This is from a paper we published in the WHO Bulletin. Very broadly, on the right-hand side, we've got individual level factors, psychological factors, motivation, and so on. And on the left-hand side, we've got structural factors. Is it safe to walk or cycle? Are there bike lanes? Are there sidewalks? And so on and so forth. And this fed into the World Health Organization Global Action Plan on Physical Activity, which fundamentally takes a systems approach. It says we need to think not just about the intervention here and the intervention there, but how these things interact. What is the system that supports or hinders physical activity, and how do we influence that system? Of course, we do need some of these individual specific interventions, but we need to see how they fit together because they interact with one another. We have unintended consequences. How do we anticipate those unintended consequences and do something about them? The concept of complexity is, you won't be surprised to hear, complex. But I think one of the key things to communicate is the difference between things that are complicated and things that are complex. So a Saturn V rocket is extremely complicated, but if you know what you're doing and you've got all the right parts and all the right tools, you can build one of these things and you can put 3 extremely brave volunteers into that little cone right at the top and send them off to the moon. Now, I don't know how long a moonshot takes. Let's say it's 5 days. But if we were to build one of these things just out in front of the building and get 3 brave volunteers from the audience and send you off, once we've launched it, we will then know to within a few minutes and a few hundred meters exactly where to pick you up from in the Seine when you come back 5 days later. So it's extremely complicated, but it is controllable and manageable and predictable. The 2007 UK government foresight report on obesity represents a different category of problem, because this is a complex problem. And lots of people hate this map because it's a terrible spaghetti diagram and you can't work out what it means and it's a mess. For me, that is the point. The point of this figure is to show you that obesity represents a different category of problem from building a space rocket. Because things are connected to one another. Broadly, we have a positive energy balance loop in the middle. We evolved to be hunter-gatherers. When you see a woolly mammoth, you kill it and eat it. When there are no woolly mammoths around, you put your feet up in the cave watching television. You conserve energy. On the right-hand side, we've got physical activity. On the left-hand side, we've got food. At the top, we've got social and cultural stuff. At the bottom, we've got biology, physiology, genetics. Right-hand side is about physical activity. The very, very best donuts I ever ate in my life were at a Department of Health regional obesity leads meeting in London. I had arrived on the train on the western side of London. I had cycled hard across London with my little folding bicycle. I got to the meeting. I saw the donuts. The wrap was still on them because these were regional obesity leads, so they didn't eat donuts. I had a donut. It was so good, I had a second one. I had expended about 250 calories cycling there and consumed about 600 calories worth of donuts when I got there. Physical activity was met with a response which was to consume energy. These things interact. You go to the gym, you work out for an hour, you buy a chocolate bar from the vending machine on your way home. It's the system. The other thing about systems that people forget is that systems adapt. So I'm on the evaluation team for our national sugar-sweetened drinks tax. And a logic model for how such a tax works is pretty straightforward. And all you really need to know is the price elasticity of demand for sugar-sweetened drinks. Put up the price, people buy less, they consume less, obesity goes down. Well, of course, it's not that simple. Because at every step along the way, the system pushes back. Before the tax is even brought in, industry tries to stop it happening, tries to make it as small as possible. Some of the adaptations are really positive. They're about reformulation. So between the announcement of our tax and its introduction, around a third of drinks had reduced their sugar to below the tax threshold. It's not all bad adaptation, but the system responds to intervention. So if you think you're going to get a simple linear relation like this, cause and effect from one end to the other, you're kidding yourself, because the system will respond. So it would be extraordinary if putting in a tax led to a reduction in obesity because of all these adaptations along the way, let alone the fact that sugar-sweetened drinks are only one small part of what contributes to obesity. Actually, we have seen some changes in girls resulting from this tax, but I wasn't expecting it. It's pretty amazing that we have. And we shouldn't expect it. So when we're evaluating these interventions, what we shouldn't be doing is expecting this. Instead, we can look at the system and look at the other things that might happen. Does bringing in a sugar-sweetened drinks tax change the acceptability of fiscal interventions in the food system? Might it mean that other things can happen? What are the other responses? I just wanted to finish with a couple of other points. So one of the points is that when you start talking about systems, people think it's all about modelling. And that's part of it, but it's by no means all of it. I'm on a European Horizon project called Co-Create, where we've worked with young people across 5 different countries to get them to map out what they see as the drivers of obesity. Very interestingly, so this map was put together, this is a composite map that was put together by 15-year-olds across Europe. Really interestingly, when you get old people like me to say what a system map of obesity looks like, we've got physical activity and diet and a bit about stigma. When you ask young people, a third of the things they talk about relate to mental health, mental well-being, social media, stigma, and so on. Now, that may or may not be actually the case, it's an opinion, but it's a very powerful tool for saying there is a hypothesis here that there is something going on in young people's mental health in relation to obesity that the old people like me are not looking at. So we're looking at it. This is very much a qualitative tool for hypothesis generation, but actually we've extended that and we've built a system dynamics model, and then we can model the potential impact of changes within the system. So we can move from the qualitative to the quantitative using the same sorts of tools. And broadly, there's a range here from systems thinking, the stuff I'm mostly doing, which is just about seeing the world differently, seeing that there's a system there. You can still do your randomized controlled trial, but think about how adaptation might affect it, up to the other end, where you can build a model and do something quantitative. And I wanted to end by talking about time, because this, it seems to me, is something we've lost sight of in public health. We're always asking, what do we do now, and not thinking really hard about where we want to be. So when we think about childhood obesity interventions, I don't think I've ever seen a childhood obesity intervention that is really focused on reducing lifelong risks from obesity. We just say, obesity tracks from childhood into adulthood, we need to minimize obesity in childhood, and then move on. So we do lots of things for children in primary schools where they are young enough to be coerced that then stop. One of the things we do is set up walking school buses. You drop your child a kilometre from school, all the kids get together, they meet in a car park somewhere, they put on a high visibility vest, they walk hand in hand in a group with a teacher at each end, and they go to the school. So what we've done there is we've taught them that walking is a weird behaviour that needs personal protective equipment in the form of a high visibility vest. What about, and then they go to secondary school and they stop walking. What about if we used walking school buses as a tool to ensure that we have safe environments in which kids can wear whatever they like and they can all walk to school, whatever happens? That then creates safe routes, not just to school, but safe routes to everywhere for everyone. So think differently about these things and how they might have an impact through the life course. The final thing to discuss is about levers for change. So when we're thinking about systems, one of the things to think about is the level of the system at which one intervenes. Now, this is really too difficult for a 20-minute talk, but my friends and colleagues in Canada, Diane Finegood and Lee Johnston, put out a paper a few years ago where they set up something called the intervention level framework. And broadly, all you need to get from this is that there is a range from doing simple operational stuff to changing the entire goals and paradigms of the system. They put in 5 levels. There are others with 12, there are others with 4, but there's a range. They then analysed a load of obesity strategies, and what they found was that almost everything was at the basic operational level, and almost nothing was trying to change the fundamental drivers of the system. An example of what changing the fundamental drivers of the system looks like is the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act in Wales, which says that all public bodies need to take the account of their policy, not just on the current generation, but on future generations, as a result of which some motorway extensions and other road building projects have not happened because of the impact in relation to the climate emergency. That changes the fundamental goals and the fundamental drivers of the system, and a whole load of other things, operational things, happen as a result. So if we come back to the Swinburne diagram, I guess what I'm saying is not that we need to stop doing individual level stuff, although we need to be careful about widening inequalities when we do, but that we need to rebalance this and also act much more at structural level, and thinking and working in systems is part of that. And the reason this talk is called chess, not checkers, is that if you play, do you know what I mean by checkers or drafts? Simple game. It's on a chessboard, but with simple pieces. I don't know what you call that in French. Dame. Dame. Okay. Dame, not chess. In public health, we tend to play dame. We just say, what's my move? Whereas if you're good at chess, you've got a whole load of moves ahead. You've got an end game in sight. You think where you're going, and you work out a strategy to get there, and you know you won't be able to follow that strategy because your opponent will do something annoying that means you have to change, and you adapt. So I'm arguing that in public health, we need to play dame, not chess, and think differently, think about the future, think where we're trying to get, and understand that we're trying to do all of that within messy, complex systems. So there's some conclusions. You don't need me to read them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Harry. That was a fantastic call to arms and some wonderful, wonderful, encouraging, but also worrying concepts that you introduced there, so thank you. We have 10 minutes now for questions, comments for both our speakers, for Letitia, who gave a really excellent introduction to the issues, and for Harry. And people will have to speak into microphones so that we can translate. So if you'd just like to put your hand up if you have a question or a comment, and a microphone will arrive. Anybody want to start? It's not essential. Pierre, I don't know whether you have any thoughts?
Maybe. Oh, sorry.
Camille as well. Question down here, Camille.
Bonjour, Camille Perchot, chercheuse en géographie.
Hello, Camille Perchot. Harry.
Pardon, c'est mieux comme ça?
Is that better this way?
Harry, j'ai une question.
Harry, I have a question.
Intervention sur des systèmes complexes.
On complex systems initiatives, we managed to identify determinants. Can you hear us?
Est-ce que c'est mieux?
Is that better? Can you hear me? Is that better?
Try again.
Est-ce que c'est mieux comme
Is
ça?
that better? Yes?
In
terms of interventions on complex systems, what is important is the way we will intervene in terms of on timeline. Do we have to act simultaneously on all these determinants, or should we schedule interventions depending on distal or proximal determinants?
It depends. That's a really good question, and one of the objections to the spaghetti diagram from Foresight, in fact all of the spaghetti diagrams that I ever produce, is that's terrifying, we can't possibly do all of that. But that's where I come back to time. For a problem like obesity, or young people's mental ill health, or knife crime, or climate change, or whatever it is, these things have not happened overnight. We're not going to reverse them within a year. I mean, I talk about a 20-year vision. It might be 10 years, it might be 30, depending on the problem. But let's just think about a big problem and think about a 20-year vision. You then need a 5-year strategy for what is feasible within the current political context. And you then need a 1-year plan. It's entirely appropriate for the politician to say, what do I do now? But if you've got a right-of-centre government, the things you'll say to the politician might be different from if you have a left-of-centre government. Their priorities will differ. But in 20 years' time, you want to end up in the same place. So how do you eat a bowl of spaghetti? You stick your fork in and you start and you carry on until you've finished. You don't eat the entire bowl at once. But if you change 5% a year, if you eat 5% with each forkful, if you deal with 5% a year, after 20 years, you've dealt with 100%. The priority and the ordering in which you do that depends on the context. So you've done amazing things in Paris in terms of active travel and physical activity over recent years. If I was coming to Paris to talk about physical activity, I wouldn't be saying, sort out your cycling in Paris. I don't know what else I'd do, but I'd look somewhere else. Whereas if you go to a different place where they've done nothing on walking or cycling, you might start there. So where we start depends on the local context. But we should be thinking about, we should never think we've got to do it all at once. Of course we don't. There's another point, which is that some of the levers are about activating other things to happen. So one of the core points with obesity is that it is characterized wrongly as a failure of the individual rather than what it actually is, which is a set of failures of the environment, all sorts of environment, economic, social, physical. Until and unless we stop seeing obesity as the fault of people with obesity and see it as a set of environmental failures, I can understand why politicians don't want to do politically difficult things to address this stigmatized problem that they see as just the fault of the fat people, which it isn't. So some of these actions are not about an intervention in the normal sense, they're about reshaping the system to make it ready for other things to happen.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you, Harry. Yeah, unless there are any questions online or comments? No, in that case, would you like to introduce our next speaker?
Merci. Should I ask my question in English? No, it's okay.
Mathilde
Pascal, je travaille sur le climat à Santé publique France et je trouvais très intéressant les présentations et notamment le fait que quand on arrive au niveau des paradigmes du système, il n'y a quasiment aucun travaux. Est-ce que vous pensez que la santé publique devrait aller étudier justement ces questions et notamment vis-à-vis de la crise climatique, des inégalités sociales, de la biodiversité, finalement étudier la question de la sobriété et de ses impacts sur la santé? Je suis désolée, c'est une question pas facile, mais...
No, I'm not sure I understand your question because the answer is yes.
But we are not doing it at all at the moment.
Well, we're doing it a little bit, but absolutely we need to do more. So I'm co-chair of a Lancet commission that is looking at the syndemic links or the system links between non-communicable disease, infectious disease, particularly pandemics, and environmental degradation. So we have a set of common problems with common drivers. We have a food system that is harming the environment, that is producing ultra-processed foods, that are making people sick, that is putting animals in closer contact with humans, increasing the likelihood of pandemics, which are then affecting the people who are more sick because of the unhealthy food system, and so on. These things are related, and there are some common things we can do to address them. So if we ignore big picture structural factors, such as the climate emergency and much wider environmental problems, then we're missing some of the key drivers of the biggest health problems that we face. So my answer is yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
And thank you for the question.
Thank you very much.
Bonjour, donc maintenant nous avons le plaisir d'accueillir Camille Perchou, qui a accepté le challenge de venir nous présenter. Elle est géographe de la santé, en particulier avec une compétence en géographie quantitative et aussi en planning urbain. Et elle travaille à l'Institut luxembourgeois de recherche en socio-économie. Et je vous invite. Merci.
Bonjour à tous.
Hello, everyone.
Merci beaucoup pour cette invitation.
Thank you for this invitation. So we'll talk about a socio-ecological approach to determinants of health.
Pas de conflit d'intérêt.
No conflict of interest, obviously.
En quelques mots,
In a nutshell, the socio-ecological model explains how an individual interacts with their environment in the formation of behavior and shaping health behavior. More or less, before the 60s, the individual is the only one responsible of their behavior. But with the socio-ecological, we stop blaming the individual, we give some dignity back to the individual, and we think about the system in which the human being evolves that actually plays a role in the shaping of health behavior over time. This is a model which is governed by a certain number of principles. The most iconic one is that there are several levels of determinants that have an impact on health behavior. When we talk about levels of determinants, we talk about the individual level, the individual, him or herself, then the interpersonal level, the individual and their interactions with people surrounding that person, but also cultural interactions, the environmental level, the buildings, transport, the socio-economic environment, and the organizational level, namely political factors. These interact together to shape behaviors. The socio-economic behavior, the attitudes of an individual, the individual behavior modify a way an individual can apprehend their environment. And the socio-ecological model is specific to a specific interest, to a specific behavior that's not specifically transferable to another environment. So what I would suggest is to see how the socio-ecological model can explain the physical activity and sedentary lifestyle. We have to be attentive to the multi-level, the interactivity and the specificity levels. May it be in terms of observation, but also interventions with different age groups. May it be children, teenagers, adults, and seniors. So as to talk about the multi-level determinants of activity profiles, we have an ActiCity study which takes samples from different cohorts, 99,295 adults in the Net Santé cohort that answered some online questionnaires on perceived health, but also physical activity and sedentarity lifestyle perceived, but also the STAC questionnaire, but also the leisures, transport, labor, your job, also residential environments, the way people perceive the environments, and also attitudes and social support. Rather than studying the physical activity and sedentary lifestyle in an individual way, we worked as a whole to have profiles that are contrasted depending upon the energy spent and the way they are generated. So we have 6 contrasted profiles and clusters, and we can see that less than 60% of the population is very sedentary at work, that 98% engage in sedentary leisure activities, apart from the number 6, which requires more hobbies, that is more active in terms of hobbies, and apart from cluster number 1, which is very active in social professional group, we have 5 and 6 that are more active in transport and hobbies, that account for less than 10% of the population. We looked into multi-level determinants to see if they belong to 1, 2, 3, and 4 are actually more sedentary, and we see those that are in transport and hobbies that are more active. What we see here is that a perceived residential environment with a strong presence of services, of cycle paths, reduces the odds of belonging to the sedentary cluster and it reduces by 25 to 36%. Same thing, a positive representation of walking and cycling is associated with a reduction in the odds of belonging to a sedentary profile, and also social support. When we have regular cycling and walking with the family, that reduces the odds of belonging to a sedentary profile and to be more in the active transport. So we see the different levels of determinants, the individual one with the representation, the interpersonal one with the social support, and the environmental one with the representation of the neighborhood and how it is perceived from a residential point of view. Now, if we talk about the interactivity of perceptions and attitudes, how do they interact with the built environment of residential neighborhoods in the same cohort to shape physical activity behavior? See, here we talked about the walkability of a neighborhood. We talk about walking. We assessed it in an objective way through different validated KPIs, such as the foot coverage, the connectivity of the streets in the neighborhood. And we asked about the perceived walkability. Do I see my neighborhood as something that is walkable in a low way, or medium way, or high? The perception of a neighborhood as walkable can increase to from 20 to 55 minutes of walk as to the real walkability, the actual walkability of a neighborhood. Same thing for errands. If we see that our neighborhood is walkable, it increases by 37 to 84 minutes of active transport per week, as opposed to the actual walkability of the neighborhood. So we actually rely upon the perception as a driver to adopt active behaviors. And then, when we talk about specificity of determinants with our exposure and our outcome, which is the physical activity, we looked into the way the environments were specific to sedentary behavior in specific places or areas of activity. For this, we used the Cura study, that's the contrasted urban settings for a healthy aging study, that used the GPS and an accelerometer tracking, and they answered some socio-demographic questionnaires as well. To study the specificity of environmental determinants, we have identified 4 sedentary behaviors, the total time spent, the sedentary time spent at home, the sedentary time spent in transport, on the move, and sedentary time spent on all activity places visited during the week. These 4 sedentary behaviors are objective measures drawn from the GPS and the accelerometer tracking. We use 2 time measurements, the total time, accumulated, accrued, and also the extended one with breaks of 20 minutes. That will mainly represent the sedentary time that is that undermines health. As for seniors, and when we awake, we have 8 hours of sedentary time. 75% of sedentary time is done at home, 14% in transport, and 11% in activities that are outside the residence. Amongst these 8 hours, 68% of sedentary time is in extended sedentary, so chunks that are larger than 20 minutes. In terms of social determinants, we could see that there's a strong street connectivity that's not only for residential environments, but also for all the activity places that have been visited over the period of time under study, and increases 66 minutes by 66 minutes for the sedentary. Again, parking spaces in all the spaces that would increase the sedentary time by 28 to 48 minutes. As for our assumption of specificity of environmental determinants with the behaviors, we couldn't demonstrate it yet. These 2 environmental determinants are actually strongly associated to sedentary time depending on the activities practiced. But as for sedentary time spent at home or in some activities, interesting activity venues, we're not going to talk about this for statistics accuracy, but this is, well, but we can see in a systematic way that there are strong associations between the environment and prolonged sedentary periods. So if we have an environmental intervention here, we would try to look for prolonged sedentary periods. This is interesting. These interactive dimensions, these multi-level determinants show the intervention, underpinned a study that was run on to promote physical activity amongst young people. That's ECAPS. That's a randomized initiative for secondary school students focusing on physical activity and sedentary lifestyle. That's for 11-year-olds when they got into middle school. Depending upon the urbanity level and the socioeconomic group where these schools were located, this study was carried out. It has a cohort of 900 students, pupils, and it's an intervention study that is universal. All the pupils from the ECAPS action could be a part of this study. On the flip side, those from the control side, they would follow the usual side, the usual program. And then we have a follow-up after 2 years. What is interesting to note is that this would target all the movement behaviors, structured physical determinants such as clubs, but also sedentary time, time spent in front of TV, playing video games, which is a lot of sedentary time actually. This study was funded by the ANR. This was under the impetus of Professor Simon. She didn't contribute directly, but it's important to show her because it's a proof. It's a proof of efficiency. This is a study focusing on intervention at multi-levels, where we go in the environment of the subject study, where we see the representation of physical activity, the knowledge, the attitude, the motivation. This intervention, this initiative aims at changing, amending the social support to create a structure that is conducive to physical activity with families, teachers, educators, to create an environment where the teenager can use this new knowledge in a synergic way with their social environment. And the aim was to change the physical and institutional conditions of physical activity by proposing other physical activity opportunities that are more numerous, that are safe, but also by diminishing the usual barriers that are financial, for instance. This initiative is multi-level but also intersectorial because a lot of stakeholders took part into the chain of this socio-ecological model. And this intervention had a positive impact on weight. ICAPS teenagers had an incidence on reducing their excess weight, as we can see on the graph here. This study had a beneficial impact on behaviors. There were more structured physical activity, the percentage of engagement in that type of structured physical activity for active transportation, and also TV time. If there's an impact from 4 years, this positive impact continues after 2 years after the end of this initiative. So that shows that it's a proof of concept. That then gave rise to a rollout at the national level with INPES and Professor Simon. 15 pilot sites were chosen with quantity and quality studies for this ICAP study. And we had a MOOC that was made available. Then there was a second phase at the national level around the creation of a national center for the deployment of physical activity and fight against sedentary lifestyle that supports and assesses the rollout, the scalability throughout the French cities in 23, 24 or 31 ICAPS projects. Less than half are in underprivileged socio-economic regions. The socio-ecological model works. And so we wonder, how could we find new methods to re-explore this socio-ecological model, to have in situ and real-life data so as to inform and model new actions or complementary action, forms of action. We can talk about a temporary ecological assessment. That's a sampling throughout the day of participants' experiences and behaviors in situ and in real time. This is generally supported by a mobile phone. Not only, but essentially. And with this example, we have a sampling of the different behaviors and perceptions in the morning, at noon, in the afternoon, and in the evening, when we have different forms of activity. We are in different environments, and we are surrounded by different people. And we can see a certain number of concepts and variables that could be found on the causal link between the environment and the outcome, and we can respond depending on the socio-ecological model. If we give and feed the temporary ecological assessment, we can say where and when behaviors are carried out, but also in which areas this activity is made, or with whom, to look for the social interactions and why, with the perceptions, the attitudes, the emotions, to understand and outline the behaviors so as to feed information, just-in-time adapted interventions to look for the most conducive moments to change behaviors. We can also look into controlled virtual experiments. Virtual reality can help us change and test controlled virtual environments while maintaining a high level of realism, so we can have strong ecological validity because we're still assessing an environment on a behavior. Here, what you have is virtual copies of two street segments. Above, you have a pedestrian pavement, and you have trees
même si le trottoir est large,
below. Even if the pavement is wide, you see only 4 ways on the one hand and a parking space on the other.
À l'aide d'un ensemble de infrastructures expérimentales et ici
with a lot of infrastructures used for experiment purposes, we can make our participants walk in the virtual reality, and we can change depending on the number of steps. We can manipulate and change some environmental factors such as pedestrian traffic, but also car traffic, and we can also make a breakdown of all these factors so we can actually change and we can understand the socio-ecological factors, because sometimes we cannot always assess the share that is attributable to each factor. So as a conclusion, as a wrap-up, we can say that the socio-ecological model is straightforward. If it's not underpinned by environments and public policies that make health choices practical, attractive and economical, however, it requires an implementation that is interdisciplinary, cross-sectorial, but also that is focused on citizens with a co-construction for the implementation of this model. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Camille. That was a wonderfully elegant description of some really interesting data. It's my pleasure now to introduce our last speaker, who is Michele Cecchini from OECD, based here in Paris. Michele is a very distinguished medical health economist who has perhaps done more than anybody to address Harry's dangerous olive of evidence by providing some really powerful health economic support for public health intervention. So very much looking forward to your discussion. Thank you. And there will be another Q&A session after that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bonjour à tous et à toutes.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for this introduction. My name is Michele Cecchini. I will continue my presentation in English, but first of all, I wanted to thank Santé Publique France for this invitation today and for the sterling cooperation we had during the assessment of the French tobacco control policy. I'd like to thank, well, there are lots, actually too many people I'd like to thank, but I'd like to particularly thank France Imbrec, Pierre Louison and Yabuyotan for the great cooperation.
For the rest of my presentation, and I'll tell you a little bit more about how OECD, in collaboration with Santé Publique France, has evaluated the French program on tobacco. We heard at the beginning of this morning La DG Générale Santé speaking about the objective of having a generation free from tobacco in the next decade or so. We think, and that's a preview of what I'm going to say, that the policy that has been put in place in the last few years is a very positive step into this direction. Of course, there is a need to do much more to reach this goal. But let's start from some analysis. If we compare France against other OECD and the European countries, we see that the situation of tobacco smoking in France is inquiétant, as we wrote it in French, is really worrying. France has the second highest tobacco consumption currently among adults in the European Union, just below Bulgaria, with 1 in 4 French adults that smoke on a daily basis. And in terms of people aged 15 and 16, teenagers, we see that more than 20% of this population group smokes, which is above the EU25 average, although not the highest one. There are also some other worrying statistics that we should pay attention to, but there are also some positive messages. Some of the things that we need to pay attention is that females are a higher smoker compared to the European average, to the OECD average, and the prevalence of tobacco smoker among females is the 3rd highest among OECD countries. young children, again, we see that for people aged 12, there is already 1% of these children that smoke tobacco, and then this percentage increases as they become older. Finally, our latest statistics show that the average consumption of return cigarettes per day on average in 2020, which is a 33% decrease compared to 2002. Clearly, this is a good news, but we also know that the big difference in terms of risk factor is between smokers and non-smokers rather than on the amount of cigarettes that are smoked. If we look at the trends over time, this is a slide that someone else this morning has presented before me. We see that there has been some positive achievement since 1991 in France with an overall decrease in tobacco consumption. The major decreases that France experienced are all in the conjunction of the implementation of new policy packages. And as Professor Rutter told us this morning, we need to combine population-level intervention with individual-level intervention. I think that this is a good example of how the complexities related to tackling tobacco consumption and how France managed to put together population-level policies and individual-level policies to tackle this great public health threat for the country. The first package of intervention was implemented in 1991 with the Loi event that put together policies to increase the price of tobacco, but also to decrease advertisement, forbid advertisement for tobacco products, as well as forbidding smoking in public places. The second set of measures was implemented at the beginning of 2000, between 2002 and 2004. Again, we saw almost a 6% decrease at the population level of tobacco, and these were again a mix of tobacco policies. And then most recently, and that was the focus of the study that we carried out, a most recent set of measures that was implemented between 2016 and 20. And I'll tell you a little bit more in details on this slide. There are 4 pillars as part of this policy. There is the Moins sans tabac that was implemented in 2016. This is a flagship intervention managed by Santé Publique France. It's a media campaign, a network campaign to support people that want to quit and to increase the number of people that quit tobacco smoking. In 2017, there was the introduction of the Paquet Nectar, the package without any particular figure on it, but negative figures. Between 2018 and 2020, there was an increase in the tobacco taxation with an increase of price of more than 40% on the type of tobacco that is most sold in the country. And then in 2019, there was the introduction of reimbursement for the substitutes of nicotine, of tobacco smoking, which is possibly the most expensive component in the whole package implemented by France. But it's a very important one because substitute of nicotine have a cost, and particularly it's a great support for people in lower socioeconomic group that want to quit smoking. In terms of analysis, I don't want to go too much into the methodological details. You find information on our modeling approach at the link on this slide. But fundamentally, we have developed, and with the data provided by Santé Publique France, we have adapted our microsimulation model to depict the trends in tobacco smoking resulting from the implementation of the package, and we have projected how this policy may provide additional results in the years to come. I'm going to present you results for what we call the average scenario, but we assessed a number of different scenarios based on various factors, including some of the negative trends we saw during the early phases of COVID, in which we saw an increase of tobacco consumption. So, in a nutshell, these are the achievements between now and 2050 of the implementation of the tobacco policy in France. We forecast that France could avoid 4 million cases of NCDs related to tobacco consumption between 2023 and 2050. The positive effect that the decrease in chronic diseases has been measured on two big dimensions. One is on workforce productivity. Persons that do not develop cancer, persons that do not develop cardiovascular diseases caused by tobacco consumption are more likely to stay active in the workforce. If they have a job, they are less likely to take sick leaves. They are less likely to retire early because they are better health. And this corresponds to about 19,800 additional people in the workforce, in the market, in the workforce market. To give you an idea, an hospital, an university hospital, such as one in Lille or Toulouse, has a workforce of about 16,000 people. So we are talking about a significant amount of extra people that can contribute to the workforce. People that are healthier have also lower expenditure for health, and we calculated that every year France is saving almost 600 million euros, 578 million euros due to reduced healthcare expenditure. Bear in mind that this number takes into account that people that do not develop diseases due to tobacco may develop other diseases. And if they don't die, they may stay alive and they may develop other diseases, chronic diseases, including dementia, for example, and so on. So this gives you also an idea of the extra expenditure that France may incur. Nonetheless, there is a clear saving in health expenditure, which correspond to about 18% of the healthcare budget of a region such as Bourgogne-Franche-Comté. Finally, the implementation package has a cost. Which is much smaller compared to the saving in healthcare expenditure. We calculated for each euro invested by France into this package, France has a return on investment of about 4 euros, is 1 to 4, which is an excellent return on investment, possibly in the order of magnitude of even Bitcoin at the beginning of the bubble, and it's great saving for the country. A special focus of our report is on the Mois sans tabac, which is one of the key elements of this policy. We calculated that the contribution of Mois sans tabac is about 1/5 of the whole package. And it's a very effective and cost-effective policy. Our calculations suggest that Mois sans tabac avoid about 500,000 cases of chronic diseases in the period, and the economy is in the order of magnitude of 94 million euros for each year in terms of healthcare expenditure. Finally, there is also a positive impact on the number of workforce that contributes to the economy. One of the other focuses of our analysis is on understanding whether COVID-19 and the trends we saw in 2020, 2021, how they may have impacted the implementation of the policies and the positive effect achieved during the policy. Between 2019 and 2021, we saw that the number of prevalent people, the prevalence rate, has remained fundamentally stable at the population level. It increased a little bit, but it increased significantly, particularly for women. 1 in 4 persons that define themselves as a smoker has increased the number of cigarettes consumed, with the priority area persons being women, young people, and a person with higher level of education that teleworked. So teleworked in a way, people that telework were more likely to increase their consumption of tobacco. finally, bad news, during the confinement and the initial period of COVID, the number of persons that got engaged in wines and tobacco responded to this policy decreased, and we calculated that the impact of COVID may have decreased the impact of the policies by 10 to 15%. I stop here. I thank you for your attention. You can find the report in French at the link on the screen. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. That was wonderful, very powerful evidence. So we have time for questions or comments for both our speakers. I have one here.
Bonjour. Merci beaucoup pour ces présentations.
Hello, thank you very much for this morning's presentation. They were very interesting. I was also interested to see that in my home region in Bourgogne-Franche-Comté, we could generate 600 million euros of savings that we could probably reinject into health prevention promotion. Now, joking aside, I was really interested in what you said about giving back or focusing again on epidemiological studies to assess mortality and morbidity, but also to try and specify which are the main health determinants. This is indeed paramount, and Santé Publique France does some very interesting work on this. Now, I wanted to slightly focus on what we sometimes call the science of solutions, which was presented by a number of speakers this morning. So, what type of action can be taken to address these issues related to health determinants? And in this regard, two models have been presented, one based on complex systems, what you called complex systems, and another one on the socio-economic approach. And I have to say that it resonated with me, because it's really the same as the Ottawa Charter model and the model of health promotion with the 5 strategies proposed by the WHO in the 1980s. So it's quite old already. So as far as the model that you have presented is concerned, the socio-environmental model, is there any difference with the sort of model championed by the Ottawa Charter and health prevention? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your question. I don't know whether, Michele, you'd like to answer that, and Camille also.
Does it work? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks for the question, and happy to contribute that the tobacco French strategy contributes to the decrease in the expenditure for your region. Not all the money that I mentioned go to your region, but your region also gets its fair share of savings. Now, in terms of the type of intervention, this morning we discussed a lot on the complexities related to overweight, obesity, and physical activity. Professor Rutter is really an expert in this field, and clearly, he used this as an example. I'm sure that if we looked at tobacco rather than many others that were mentioned this morning, environment, we could see the same type of complexities. The health promotion and prevention is a very important area, and the Ottawa Charter is really the starting point. Based on that, there are a number of areas. Yesterday, for example, in the session of alcohol, we talked a lot about the best buys, which is the WHO best buys, that OECD contributed to the calculation of some of these best buys. It's a mixing of different dimensions that should be taken into account in deciding which type of policies we need to combine. I definitely agree that we need a mix of both population-level policies and individual-level policies. Other things that we should take into account is the effectiveness of the policy, how much is the bang for the type of policy we implement, the affordability. France is a high-income country, as well as the vast majority of OECD countries. But there are type of intervention that in some cases perhaps we are not able to buy, or they are too costly even for high-income countries. They tend to be more individual level intervention than population level intervention, feasibility of the intervention, as well as their impact on social inequalities. With this in mind, I think that is some of the components that France has kept in mind when they designed their tobacco strategy, which is really based on the best buys from WHO.
Thank you. And Camille, given what we know about complex systems, what sort of interventions do you think we should be supporting?
I think, like, based on en français ou en anglais, pardon. Basé sur, en tout cas, l'exemple qu'on a donné ici, un des principes du modèle socio-écologique, c'est aussi d'agir simultanément sur l'ensemble des déterminants du modèle. Peut-être une des aspects qui n'a pas été mis en évidence dans ce qui a été présenté. Mais on est également dans une approche complexe. Le système socio-écologique ne vient pas contre l'approche complexe, mais bien s'intégrer dans une approche complexe, avec le fait qu'appuyer sur un déterminant peut agir sur certains comportements ou avoir un effet ricochet sur d'autres déterminants.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. I particularly like the question because as you are encouraging us not to abandon our previous knowledge, but to build on that previous knowledge in the future. I mean, even interventions that we might think of as simple, like vaccination, have to be seen as a complex intervention now, because of course, if the population are not supportive of your vaccination campaign, it won't work. So it's a progression in our understanding, not a revolution. Thank you. Question here.
Oui, bonjour.
Ça va?
Okay. Bonjour, la question est
Good morning.
à Monsieur Tabac.
This is a question for Mr. Tobacco. Could you put back? Could you put some? Give us some perspective between smoking, vaping, and cannabis, but particularly vaping. Isn't it actually the emergence of e-cigarettes and of this practice which has had an effect? So at the end of the day, shouldn't tobacco control campaigns be extended to the overall concept of smoking or vaping, because other substances may have a harmful effect on health, even though we cannot maybe measure them yet?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a question that we thought it would arrive at a certain point, particularly in a country such as France, in which there is really a growing number of people that is using, and youngsters in particular, that are using alternative to tobacco smoking. The French strategy that we assessed did not include a component to tackle these other forms of smoking. That certainly is something that is becoming a growing public health problem, I think. There is still perhaps less information in terms of both the patterns and trends of consumption. I thought something is coming, as well as to what extent this type of smoking support starting of smoking of other type of cigarettes. My understanding, for what I've read until so far, is that yes, there is clearly an increase in likelihood that people, perhaps youngsters, that start smoking electronic cigarettes then will continue smoking tobacco in the future, as well as to what extent this type of products help people that are tobacco smoker to switch to electronic cigarettes, which are less harmful to some extent compared to tobacco. Again, my understanding from data from the US, I'm not aware of anything in France, is that the vast majority of people do not really switch from tobacco to electronic cigarette, but smokes both. I think in the US, some surveys suggest that 85% of people that smoke electronic cigarettes is also a tobacco smoker, which means that fundamentally people become dual smokers compared to two. I think France, but other OECD countries in the year to come, as evidence data are made available, should also think about strategies on how to control this type of other smoking.
Thank you, Michaela. We, just on electronic cigarettes, we are producing a report in England from the Royal College of Physicians, which presents a slightly more positive view than you've just pointed out there from the States, where the situation in the States is different from some European countries. And so I think it's context dependent. We would say in the UK that there are many smokers, tens of thousands of smokers who have switched completely, and so you can calculate the numbers of lives and deaths prevented from that. And we don't see quite the same problem with youth smoking as in the States, but it's an emergent field. It actually, the electronic cigarettes characterized as one of the determinants of a complex system, which is self-organization. So not only is it emergent, it will change, but electronic cigarettes were not a public health intervention developed by the public health establishment. They were generated by the industry and were promoted by smokers. So it's a really good example of dealing with a complex system. And it did throw the public health community. I mean, there's no doubt about it that the public health community did not know how to handle electronic cigarettes when they first came about. So we need to collect the evidence and we need to understand it as part of a complex intervention. But thank you. Another question. I don't know who was first, actually. I think the gentleman at the back. Yes. Yeah.
Merci.
Thank you. I work for an ARIS, regional health agency on the Reunion Island. My question is about the complexity of decision-making. You said at the start of this session that so there's the silo effect in health, but we have lots of policies that are interrelated, social policies, health policies. The problem is that decision makers are sometimes very remote from our concerns. Health programs that require a long-term vision, but politicians have a short-term reasoning because of political elections. Now, my question is, have you studied the complexity of decision-making systems overall, particularly in health? Because this is quite interesting. When you are a health worker, it's actually quite taxing to see that no decisions are made, that there are no decisions made on the basis of sometimes compelling evidence. Thank you.
That's a very, very good question. I don't know if you'd like to comment on. Yes.
I'll try to answer that one. Yeah.
Well, I think that looking at the different addresses yesterday and today, we can see that there are still a lot of silos. There's very little understanding of the different disciplines, of the different professions. That's why we need a co-construction approach. We need to all sit around the table. It's not only about working upstream or downstream and trying to determine what's been successful or not afterwards. I think it's one of the keys that made a program like ICAP successful, because it has brought together citizens, elected officials, schools, members of the medical profession, also people who encourage people to exercise, to take physical exercise. But it always has to be in the environment where we want to take our actions. But I'm afraid I don't think there's any or ready-to-use answer. I think it's very important to try and define and understand concepts and obstacles to try and find common solutions that are adapted to the environment. But that's an interesting approach indeed.
Thank you. Thank you. I might comment in my role as a public official whose job it is to present evidence to policymakers, that my experience is that the mistake we make as researchers is to assume that the policymakers share our view of the world, our hierarchy of evidence, our understanding of the evidence, and we don't spend enough time to understand their world and to think of what their questions are at the beginning of our research work, so that it's not so much about, the researchers often feel that there's a gap in translating and promoting their evidence into policy, whereas the opposite is often the problem, that there isn't sufficient appetite for evidence in policy. And we can only address that. There's some good research work that's been done by the University of Stirling on the empirical evidence of how evidence is used by policymakers. So it is a problem which is amenable to study, but is very rarely studied. We usually just shout louder and publish more and more papers and expect the policymakers to read them, but of course they don't. So anyway, for the next year's conference, we can have a session on that. I think that would be very good. There was a gentleman here who has the microphone. And then we have
parler en français. Oui. Je retourne sur la question des cigarettes.
I'd like to come back to the issue of e-cigarettes. In Italy, we are witnessing a drop in tobacco use, however, a rise in nicotine use. Because some people start with vaping and they keep vaping. My question is, should we start talking about addiction to nicotine rather than addiction to tobacco, and should we try to start and regulate nicotine use by in terms of public policy? Otherwise, I think this is going to play into the hands of the industry, because the industry is really trying to encourage people to use nicotine using other methods, because it's more profitable for the industry. And in Italy, e-cigarettes are less taxed than other products. That's what I wanted to know.
Thank you. We could spend a lot of time talking about e-cigarettes. I think it's a really good example of a complex intervention. That's for sure. And I think your point about regulation is extremely important, and we have to see it in balance. But I think unless anybody on the panel wants to comment further on e-cigarettes, I think it's a very good point, and we could perhaps explore it more. We have another question down there.
Hello, Nadine Godin. I work in the development of psychosocial skills in the school environment. And as far as decision-making is concerned, I was wondering about the study on complexities, about interpersonal challenges in decision-making, the balance of powers, of egos, etc. Is this really taken into account in policies and in the way projects are developed, irrespective of their nature? Because I think that organizations, irrespective of their nature, have needs. People, have a thirst for recognition, etc. How are all these dimensions interrelated? Thank you.
Yes, that's a lovely question. Thank you. That's reality.
Maybe we can answer that strategy should be less on tobacco, but they should be engaged collectively. There's no strategy per se on social media that work on this discussion with people. It's used on a permanent basis, basically.
I think, it's a great question. I think fundamentally the things that we've been reminded of today are, Letitia mentioned the importance of the epidemiology and the common data, the common understanding of the data, the common understanding of the evidence, and the involvement of with Harry's talk in the end users and the people affected. And that can cut across all the various institutional conflicts and organizational barriers if we all, instead of discussing different data sets or different, we talk about the data, the outcomes and the priorities. And actually I thought the Director General for Santé put it very well. He set some global priorities that we could all sign up to. My experience of the French organizations is they are more complex than in some other European countries, but you do very well. Any other points? We have a little bit more. Yes.
Hello, Caroline Adams for Santé Publique France. First of all, my warmest thanks to the four of you for the quality of your speeches and the complementarity of the topics that have been tackled. apprehending the complexity and not making it so complex that it would quash any initiative is actually a very interesting point of view. One of the issues at stake that was mentioned that is very important is transdisciplinarity. It is necessary to apprehend this complexity, and it's not easy to implement. I had a question for Dr. Perchou on your presentation. You mentioned the differences of perception between the walkability perceived or assessed for a particular neighborhood and that is perceived by the neighborhood user, by the resident. And that can actually have impact on the physical activity of an individual. So I was wondering, what are your assumptions? How can you explain these discrepancies, these differences? Is there a link between nudging type initiatives that could have more impact than the environment quality itself? Because that would actually play on the perception. Thank you. Thank you for this question. Indeed, we are on two different and complementary concepts. The way an individual will interact with their environment, the way they live, the way they perceive it. We can think that perception is in a relationship with the causal, the way they are, the way they perceive it, and how the environment follows this perception. We can think that perceptions modify the way we experiment an environment and how it influences the behavior. We are on both mechanisms. This is my opinion. They are complementary. They're not antagonistic. Our approach is not that of nudging, but rather that perception does not necessarily match with the environment in which we live, and we saw it in a repeated way in different places, may it be in terms of walkability studies or safety studies or cyclability of neighborhoods. We always have a difference, a delta between the perception and the actual reality. That can come from different elements. For instance, men and women perceive distances differently in supermarkets, or can have different perceptions of safety depending on places or public spaces. The socio-economic factors can factor in as well. So perception can modify a behavior, but these perceptions depend on a set of factors, individual factors, interpersonal factors, and so on and so forth. And this nudging approach comes and plays also in this to stimulate behaviors that could be beneficial for health. But in a nutshell, we have to act on everything, both on perception, on knowledge of our neighborhood, the way we can use it to change our behavior and have a healthy behavior, but we cannot count on this exclusively. We also have to offer environments that can be conducive of beneficial health behaviors.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Camille. You have a question there? And then we...
I'm a psycho-practitioner. I saw the outcome of the impact of the COVID crisis on anti-smoking campaigns, 10 to 15%, as you have highlighted. And we could see the efficiency of these campaigns, because that could lead us to info, but we should fine-tune our studies. Tobacco is just a way to fight against anxiety. It helps anxious people to blow off some steam. And there's not a lot of cross cutting comparisons between the somatic data and the scientific data in this field. Maybe we should delve into some more deeper studies, but from a scientific point of view, it's more difficult to assess this than from a followed-up psychological assessment. And in the scientific realm, we work on rational data, on difficulties between the human being and their relationship with themselves.
Thank you. Yes, the importance of transdisciplinary research is absolutely right. Michele.
Yes, a quick follow-up on the comment/question. I agree. It's very interesting. Bear in mind that we had the data to assess only really the very bad phase of COVID, 2020 and 2021. One of the things that we would like to do, not necessarily linked to the French tobacco policies, but more in general, and we have a project on this as OECD, is to understand to what extent what we saw during COVID across European countries, it was a one-off, a noise in a long-term trend, or it's a shift of lifestyle behaviors. This morning I presented changes in tobacco consumption for France, but we saw for other European countries very similar patterns to some extent, also for other risk factors, physical activity, alcohol consumption, and so on. The big question, I think, is really if it was one-off and then people go back to the lifestyle and the intervention we are going to put in place to the more general trends, decreasing trends we saw in the past few years, or whether there was a switch in some way and there is a new pattern that emerges after COVID. This is something for which we probably be able to say something more in a few years' time when we have data to cover the whole period 2020 to 2023 and so on.
Thank you very much, Michele. Thank you. Well, I think, we have one more question. I think one more question and then we will wrap up, but thank you.
Ruth for France Nature Environment. Thank you for having talked about the systemic approach and the factoring in of all the variables to study health phenomena and behavioral changes. We've talked about immobilism of health politicians, but that have resulted in low probative evidence and policies. But have we talked about the SHIFT project? I would like to have your opinion on this project.
The SHIFT project. You may have to tell us more about the SHIFT project.
It's a French project that takes into account all the elements that can reduce CO2 gas emissions in the field of health. That means that we take into account health-related variables such as behavior, attitudes, prevention policies, and so on. But in a more general framework, we take into account also other elements, how to decarbonate health, including CO2 gas emissions in transportation or for the manufacturing of medicine, for instance.
Thank you. Anybody want to? Yes, Michele, and then...
Quickly, that's really an emerging area of work that we have at OECD and my team is start covering. We know that about 5% of total gas emission across OECD countries comes from the healthcare sector, broadly defined, whether it's for moving people to hospitals, moving goods to hospital, pharmaceutical, and so on. There is a lot that also we believe public health can do to decrease the impact on the impact of the health system on the carbonization of our economies. What we are doing is to look at, in the next few years, to start producing results, not just in terms of savings in terms of healthcare expenditure or increasing workforce productivity, but also look at how public health intervention modify and hopefully positively impact the production of greenhouse gases and pollution by healthcare system. So, for example, now we have a project looking at, very similar to what the colleague was presented. We look at best practices across OECD countries of how public health intervention promoting a modal shift. So, for example, walking or use of bikes in cities may impact CO2 production by people, and down the line also have a positive impact on physical activity of the population and so on.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. I mean, it's clear every public health intervention now has to bear in mind climate change and the impact. Is no question about that. Well, thank you very much for all your comments, and I'm just going to have one or two closing remarks before we thank our speakers. I mean, firstly, we've had 4 excellent talks. Letitia reminded us about the importance of the epidemiology and the huge impact of vulnerabilities on outcomes and how we need to have a plural approach to that. Professor Ratahari gave us a very clear explanation of how complexity should be considered now, and I have to say, having heard that talk, I don't think I can think in the same way about our public health, day-to-day public health problems. I'm sure I'm one of the people who was guilty of having a much more simple view because I have a problem in front of me and I can see a simple solution to it, but actually you come out of the room and it's much more, the real world is much more complex, and we cannot deny that. We have to accept the complexity. I thought Camille gave us a really lovely example of how it's possible to collect very high quality data about these complex multi-level models, and it really changes our understanding of things. And the data, there's some really elegant methods that you used. I love with the interventions as well, the use of virtual reality and so on. I mean, this is the future, I'm sure. So it was a lovely talk. And then finally, Michele, of course, shows how a really well-constructed and well-performed evaluation can produce information and data that does have real impact on policymakers. There's no doubt that the work that OECD produced and these relatively simple numbers that come out of very complex evaluations are hugely influential and do make a difference. So we've had the whole thing. And I would leave you with 3 questions. The first question we've raised is, what research makes the biggest difference to health outcomes? Is it unbiased efficacy work, or is it understanding of a complex system, even if we don't have a randomized controlled trial? Which of those has biggest impact on our health outcomes? The second big question, of course, is what type of interventions have a biggest impact, and how do we have that impact at scale? Is it possible to have a more linear intervention that has an impact at scale, or do we have to go for something which is more complex, more unpredictable, but will eventually have impact at scale? And then the third question is for you. How will you, in your different roles, use your understanding? How will this affect what you do in your everyday work and your everyday life? How will this understanding affect you and your roles? So with those questions, I'd like to, if you could join me in thanking our speakers for excellent presentations. And I'd also like to thank all of you for some really excellent questions as well. So thank you. And that's the end of the session. Thank you.